Clerk has the call.
Speaker, I move that so much of the standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the following. 1. The member for Clark moving that this House A notes that 1. On 20 and 21 February 2024, the High Court of Justice in the United Kingdom will hold a hearing into whether Walkley Award-winning Australian journalist Mr Julian Assange can appeal against his extradition to the United States of America. 2. Mr Assange remains incarcerated in His Majesty's Prison Belmarsh in the UK, awaiting a decision on whether he can be extradited to the USA to face charges for material published in 2010 which revealed shocking evidence of misconduct by the USA. And 3. Both the Australian government and opposition have publicly stated that this matter has gone on for too long. And B. Underlines the importance of the UK and the USA bringing the matter to a close so that Mr Assange can return home to his family in Australia. 2. Debate on the motion being limited to the mover, seconder and 2 other members. 3. Speaking times being 10 minutes for the mover and 5 minutes for all other members speaking. 4. Amendments to the motion not being permitted. And 5. Any variation of the arrangement being made only on a motion moved by a minister.
Well, leave is not requested because you're moving the motion, so you wish to speak to the motion for 10 minutes.
Speaker, I understand that it will be seconded, and then I read it a second time, or part of it the second time, the substantive component a second time.
We'll call for the seconder. Is the motion seconded? And I'll call the member for Fremantle.
Mr Speaker, I second the motion. Reserve my right to speak.
The question is the motion be agreed to, and give the call to the member for Clark.
Thank you, Speaker. That I move that this House A notes that on 20 and 21 February 2024, the High Court of Justice in the United Kingdom will hold a hearing into whether Walkley Award-winning Australian journalist Mr Julian Assange can appeal against his extradition to the United States of America. 2. Mr Assange remains incarcerated in His Majesty's Prison Belmarsh in the UK, awaiting a decision on whether he can be extradited to the USA to face charges for material published in 2010 which revealed shocking evidence of misconduct by the USA. And 3. Both the Australian government and opposition have publicly stated that this matter has gone on for too long. And B. Underlines the importance of the UK and USA bringing the matter to a close so that Mr Assange can return home to his family in Australia. Speaker, sadly, we've just about run out of time to save Julian Assange, because Tuesday and Wednesday, just next week, the High Court of Justice in London is hearing Julian Assange's request for leave to appeal his US extradition in what could well be Julian Assange's last 2 days before a British court. If Mr Assange is unsuccessful next week in the UK High Court of Justice, the frightful reality is that he could be on a plane to the United States of America within hours. Within hours. Good God, Deputy Speaker, this man has already been in Belmarsh High Security Prison in London for about 5 years, the prison for the worst of the worst in the UK, where they put mass murderers and terrorists. The prison where, when I visited Julian Assange in 2000, a prisoner was knifed and killed that very afternoon elsewhere in the prison. And of course, the 5 years in Belmarsh follows some 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. Surely this man has suffered enough and the matter must be brought to an end. But if he is unsuccessful next week in the London court, he could be on a plane within hours to another court, this time in the United States of America, where he will be facing 17 charges under the US Espionage Act and 1 charge under the US Computer Abuse and Fraud Act. If he is convicted, Deputy Speaker, he will be facing 175 years in prison in the United States. In other words, if he is extradited, perhaps as soon as next week, he will be more or less handed a death sentence. And why, Deputy Speaker? Why? Because this Walkley Award-winning journalist did his job. It's as simple as that. He did his job. And let's not forget that in 2010, Julian Assange, through WikiLeaks, revealed hard evidence of US war crimes and other misconduct in Iraq, in Afghanistan and at Guantanamo Bay. Who can forget, who could possibly forget, the grainy image provided to WikiLeaks by a brave whistleblower that subsequently was released under the title of Collateral Murder, the footage of a US attack helicopter gunning down and killing innocent civilians and Reuters journalists in a street in Iraq. We only know of that, Deputy Speaker, because Julian Assange made us aware of that. He was doing his job. He was exercising every right he has as a journalist to tell us about wrongdoing. Deputy Speaker, the injustice of all this is absolutely breathtaking. Absolutely breathtaking. As much as the attack on journalism is terrifying. Because if this matter runs to its shameful conclusion, then it will have set a precedent that applies to all Australian journalists. That if ever any Australian journalist annoys a foreign government in any way, and if that government is a government that the Australian government is hoping to curry favour with, then who's to say that the Australian government won't be complicit in the extradition or the transport of that Australian journalist to that country? What happens if an Australian journalist offends China at a time we're seeking to improve our relationship with China? The precedent will have been set that that journalist may well find him or herself on a plane to China. What about if we're trying to curry favour with Saudi Arabia and an Australian journalist writes something that offends Saudi Arabia? Will the Australian government come to that Australian journalist's aid? Well, the precedent will have been set, and no Australian journalist can be confident they will be safe in the future if this extradition goes ahead. And that's why we have this very, very important part of this motion, Deputy Speaker. The importance of the UK and the USA bringing the matter to a close. Finally, after 7 years in the embassy, 5 years in a high security prison, to just allow this long-suffering Australian journalist to come home, to be with his wife, to be with his children. The importance of this is so great, Deputy Speaker, that I'll be certainly jumping on a plane next Tuesday, hoping to be in London for the second day of the court hearing, because I think it's very important that a member of this parliament bears witness to what is going on in London next week, to stand with Julian's family and to offer them some comfort, and to communicate to Julian Assange and his family and his legal team the support, the widespread support already in this parliament. Let's not forget, there are dozens of members of this parliament who are members of the Bring Julian Assange Home parliamentary group. About a third, almost a third of this parliament signed an open letter to the US government not that long ago, calling for this matter to be brought to an end. Well, Deputy Speaker, today, in this place, shortly, this will be the time for all of us to take a stand, to stand up and to take a stand, and to stand with Julian Assange, stand for the principles of justice, stand for the principles of media freedom and the rights of journalists to do their job. Deputy Speaker, I'm hopeful this motion can pass this afternoon. I'm hopeful that I can go to London next week and I can make it clear to the British government and through the media to the US government that the Australian Parliament stands as one and calls for this matter to be brought to an end. Because regardless of what you might think of Julian Assange, and I acknowledge in this place there's a range of views. There are people that loathe the man. There are people who worship the man. But I tell you what, no matter which end of that spectrum you are positioned, just about everyone agrees this has gone on too long, that it must be brought to an end. And I'm confident if this parliament can support this motion this afternoon, Deputy Speaker, it will send a very powerful political signal to the British government and to the US government that the British government should not entertain the idea of Mr Assange being extradited to the US. It sends a very powerful signal to Washington that Australia stands as one, saying that this matter has gone on long enough, that regardless of what you might think of Mr Assange, justice is not being served in this case now. And that in any case he's suffered enough. For heaven's sakes, Deputy Speaker, something like 5 years in Belmarsh, about 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. How much is enough? How much is enough? This is the afternoon where this parliament takes a stand and says enough is enough, and that we call on the US, we call on the UK to let him out of prison, drop the charges, let him be rejoined with his family, let him come home. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Clark, and I give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm very glad to second this motion. Make no mistake, the Australian community wants to see Julian Assange go free. While there may well be a range of views about Mr Assange, as the member for Clark said, his further incarceration and prosecution is seen by many to represent an injustice. That's my personal view. It's not shared by everyone. It's my personal view. But there are many in this chamber and in the other place who want to see the matter resolved. Indeed, Speaker, the open letter from the co-conveners that Bring Julian Assange Home Parliamentary Friendship Group, which includes the member for Clark and the member for Bass, with whom I'm glad to share this debate, was signed by 63 members of the Australian Parliament. It is significant that both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have been clear in saying that the matter should come to an end. The Prime Minister has properly raised the matter of Julian Assange with the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom, and that marks a shift from what occurred previously. In May last year, the Prime Minister said enough is enough when it comes to the ongoing incarceration of Julian Assange, and he said nothing is served from the ongoing incarceration of Julian Assange. That's quite right, Deputy Speaker, because Julian Assange has been held in maximum security conditions at Belmarsh Prison for nearly 5 years. His health has suffered. His extradition to the US was previously denied by a UK court on the basis of his seriously poor mental health, which made him a suicide risk. And Speaker, while every country is of course entitled to apply its justice system, and the US is entitled to apply its justice system, people should remember that Julian Assange has now been imprisoned for a considerable period without having been convicted of any substantial charge. He's an Australian citizen being pursued under the United States Espionage Act for the dissemination of material the United States regards as secret. The same material has been published without legal consequence by media organisations in the US. In the open letter that I referred to earlier, which was published in the Washington Post last September, the co-conveners wrote, and 63 parliamentarians signed up to, the statement that it's wrong for Mr Assange to be further persecuted and denied his liberty when one considers the duration and circumstances of the detention he has already suffered. It serves no purpose. And the letter concluded by saying, we note with gratitude the considerable support in the United States for an end to the legal pursuit of Mr Assange from members of Congress, human rights advocates, academics and civil society, and from within the US media in defence of free speech and independent journalism. Deputy Speaker, in acknowledging the death of the American whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg last year, I noted his support for and solidarity with Julian Assange. Daniel Ellsberg was responsible for exposing some of the details of the circumstances of the Vietnam War. And in a 2021 interview, he said in relation to Julian, look, I was available for people to point to and say we support good whistleblowers, but that's just ridiculous. Whatever he's guilty of, I'm guilty of. I identify with him totally. The notion that he's guilty of something that I, the good guy, wasn't is just false. We must never forget, Deputy Speaker, that contrary to the idea that our safety and well-being depends more than anything else on secrecy, the reality is that our safety and well-being is at enormous risk when the most grave applications of state power are not held to account. In truth, the distinctive and most precious quality of all liberal democracies, including our own, is the capacity to apply open and proper scrutiny to all decision-making, but especially decision-making that involves military action or the infringement of civil liberties through a security apparatus. There are many in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in the media, in the Congress and civil society that share the view that when it comes to Julian Assange, enough is enough. It is healthy that this matter is openly and respectfully debated in all three countries, and I think I can say on behalf of co-conveners of the group, we've always found an openness in the United States and in the United Kingdom to have these conversations. That's a mark of what makes those three countries, ourselves, the United States and the United Kingdom, examples of liberal democracies at their best, the fact that we can have those conversations. But I say clearly, Deputy Speaker, that the further prosecution and incarceration of Julian Assange has no point and it serves no purpose and it should end.
Thank the member. Now, the question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for. I'll put the question. I'll put the question, and the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those are the. The question is that the suspension motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the member for Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Then I move that this House A notes that on 20 and 21 February 2024, the High Court of Justice in the United Kingdom will hold a hearing into whether Walkley Award-winning Australian journalist Mr Julian Assange can appeal against his extradition to the United States of America. 2. Mr Assange remains incarcerated in His Majesty's Prison Belmarsh in the UK, awaiting a decision on whether he can be extradited to the USA to face charges for material published in 2010, which revealed shocking evidence of misconduct by the USA. And 3, both the Australian government and opposition have publicly stated that this matter has gone on for too long, and B, underlines the importance of the UK and USA bringing the matter to a close so that Mr Assange can return home to his family in Australia.
Do I have a seconder for the motion? Yeah. The member for Bass? Oh. The member for Fremantle seconds the motion. Thank you.
The motion, Deputy Speaker, which
Thank
I think
you.
I'd already done.
And I now go to the member for Bass.
Deputy Speaker, thanks to my co-conveners, the members for Clark and the member for Fremantle, for bringing this motion forward. For more than 4,500 days and counting, Julian Assange has not experienced true freedom. We're now just a week away from a decision on his final UK court appeal, where he faces up to 175 years in prison over 17 espionage charges and 1 charge of computer misuse. We know that his life is at risk. His lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, recently said because of the treatment he suffers a major depressive episode illness. He's been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and the medical evidence is if he was extradited to the United States, those conditions would cause him to commit suicide. So his life is at risk, and I'm not exaggerating that. I joined this group due to my ongoing concerns about the treatment that he has endured over the past decade. While there are, as we've heard, a range of views about the actions of Mr Assange and WikiLeaks which can be debated, at the end of the day it's no longer the point. What I can say is that the ongoing prosecution of Mr Assange offends my sense of natural justice, my sense of human dignity and my sense of fairness. He's an Australian citizen who's endured terrible conditions and has suffered significant mental and physical challenges as a result of his ongoing incarceration due to the lengthy legal battle. It's not clear to me that Mr Assange committed any crime in the jurisdiction of the United States and that the pursuit of him by American authorities even now is an overreach and does not serve the interests of justice. Even if Mr Assange were guilty of a crime, which I'm not sure is true, and there were due punishment, hasn't he already served that punishment? Surely he has paid that price and has suffered enough. It is worth noting that the person who gathered the information published by WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, has been free for the past 7 years. Is it not ultimately a matter of fairness? The ongoing prosecution and indeed persecution of Mr Assange does not serve the interests of justice or human dignity. He ought to be released from custody and be allowed to return to Australia with his family. I echo the words of fellow parliamentary group member, the member for Bruce, who has said there can never be a legal solution to this case. It is inherently political. I also agree with Barrister Greg Barnes, SC, advisor to the Australian Assange campaign, who said, "Of course, some may say the Assange case must be allowed to take its course via the courts, because extradition is a legal process. While that is true in the vast majority of cases, this is an exceptional set of circumstances. And in that sense, it is like the case of David Hicks. Rightly, that case was resolved via the political relationship between the Howard government here and the Bush administration, because it too was a case infused with a political overlay. Now is the time to end a dangerous threat to the basic freedoms and the rule of law. We have previously managed to secure the safe return of Australian citizens under difficult diplomatic circumstances, and we have a responsibility to do the same for Mr Assange. I called on the previous government to step up and stand up to bring Mr Assange home, and I am pleased that his case now has some bipartisan support from the leaders of both parties who acknowledge that enough is enough. And I acknowledge that there has been work to lobby the US government. Our group had a constructive meeting with Ambassador Carolyn Kennedy last year to discuss the case, and I also thank parliamentary colleagues who undertook a trip to the US last year to make direct representation to our US counterparts. Prior to this trip, more than 60 colleagues across the political divide last year signed a letter of support explicitly calling on the US to drop the prosecution of Assange. It serves no purpose, it is unjust, and we say clearly, as friends should always be honest with friends, that the prolonged pursuit of Mr Assange wears away at the substantial foundation of regard and respect that Australians have for the justice system of the United States of America, the letter said. Surely we can all agree that we do not want to see an Australian citizen continue to languish in a foreign prison. Enough is enough.
Thank the member for that. I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise to support this motion. I commend the member for Clark and all of those other members who have been involved in bringing this motion before this place. And unfortunately, it is not the first time that this parliament has had to move and push to ensure that Julian Assange is brought home. But it is perhaps more critical now than ever that we speak, hopefully with one voice, to make it clear that it is time to bring Julian Assange home. Julian Assange is a brave Australian whistleblower and journalist. He's been locked in the UK's notorious Belmarsh prisons since April 2019, largely in solitary confinement, having never faced trial or been convicted. And of course, that follows years spent in the embassy. And the offence that he is charged with, ultimately, is telling the public the truth about the appalling conduct of the US military in the illegal invasion of Iraq. Now, I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but as other speakers have drawn attention to, one of the most pressing issues at the moment is Julian Assange's health and what is facing him over the coming days and potentially over the coming years. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment visited Julian in May 2019. In 2019, and even at this stage, reported serious concerns about his detention and his health. And we now, years later, have a situation where the very next thing that might happen to Julian Assange is his transport to the United States. And let's be clear that with Julian's health, any sentence of imprisonment under the notorious US Espionage Act, an extradition to the US would almost certainly be a death sentence, It cannot be allowed to come to that. That is a large part of the reason, Deputy Speaker, why you see so many people from across the political spectrum saying it has gone on for far too long, and he is now facing a grave risk to his life because it has gone on for far too long. And that is why the critical next step must be to ensure that Julian Assange is brought home. And as to the fundamental matters that underlie the whole reason for his incarceration and his imprisonment, it's that he's on trial for telling the truth. He's on trial for telling the truth. The 2010 and 2011 work of WikiLeaks, as a result of that, media organisations around the world published information that showed the US military operations engaged in attacks on civilians and other atrocities, which include images that we must now never forget, like the chilling video now known as collateral murder. Chelsea Manning, a former US soldier who is involved in leaking many of these classified documents, has already been released from prison after their sentence was commuted by former US President Obama, but Julian remains locked up. There is global support for Julian Assange to be returned home, and this is particularly strong in Australia, as it should be. He has become symbolic of journalists around the world who face attacks on press freedom, often shrinking government accountability, and in some jurisdictions, persecution ranging from political prosecutions through to murder. And as the member for Clark ably said before, this sets an incredibly chilling precedent for journalists in the future and about journalists' ability to hold governments account and to say uncomfortable things about governments that might be uncomfortable to their own government, but to know that you can do that and tell the truth without facing imprisonment and without facing a risk to your own life. And I'll also note that Prime Minister after Prime Minister in this place has signed Australia up to AUKUS, an arrangement that in our view is one where Australia fronts up with a chequebook and does what it's told to do by the other partners. But if governments think that participation in this AUKUS agreement and alliance is so critical, then surely part of that should be the insistence on human rights and the proper treatment of our citizens and of Australian citizens. And if we're sitting around the table with these governments, then we should be able to insist that Julian Assange is brought home. I commend this motion to the House. I acknowledge the work of the Parliamentary Friends of Assange. Let's join together today and say clearly, bring Julian Assange home.
I thank the member for Melbourne. I will now put the question, and the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Division required. Ring the bells.
Lock the doors. The question is that the motion be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair and the noes to the left. I point the honourable members for Werriwa and Bean as tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Parkes and Gray as tellers for the noes. Order. The result is ayes 86, noes 42. The matter is resolved in the affirmative. Order.